Hello everyone, greetings from PayTabs technical support team. In this series, you will learn how to integrate with PayTabs through our PT2 API endpoints. And here, we will walk you through the third integration type, which is the managed form. For the purpose of this series, we have created a very simple Laravel project to walk you through the integration process. But feel free to follow the steps in this series with your own project, whatever the programming language or the framework used to integrate with PayTabs. So, let's get started. In this video, we are going to learn one of our follow-up transaction or the managed transaction, which is the query transaction using the query transaction API. So, let's get started. The first thing you should know is that you can find the full documentation for this part inside PayTabs support portal under the article called the Managed Form APIs Integration Manual. Now, if we navigate to step 7 over here, you will see that step 7 is dedicated to manage your already existing transaction. So once you finish your transaction and you want to do any follow-up transaction on this one, like refund it or query it to learn more about it, or capture and void, which we will learn about throughout this series, this is the step that you want to use. Before we start, it's highly recommended to check our solution article, What is Transaction Type, to know more about the different transaction types that PayTabs have. Now in this video, we want to learn about the query transaction. And the query transaction is simply an API that PayTabs provide you in order for you to receive the details of your transactions. So for any case you haven't received the response of a certain transaction, or you want to get the details of any transaction, this is the response that you want to use or the API you want to use. Simply, you are going to send the request to PayTab. This request will contain only your profile ID and the transaction reference that you want to query it, and in return you will receive all this transaction details. Now you can use the same using the cart ID. So whenever you have a transaction that you don't have all its details, or you want to check its response, all its details, you can get these details using only the transaction reference or the cart ID. So let's see how this works. Now inside our code, we have created a simple request payload called query payload over here that is contain our profile ID and our transaction reference. Now where are we getting this transaction reference? As you can see, I'm getting it from my request, so in doing so, I have created a very simple form over here. This form only takes the transaction reference. So what I'm going to do over here, I'm going to initiate a simple transaction like this one, and I'm going to fill out my card details like this. I'm going to fill my expiration date. Then once I check out, I should be redirected normally, and now I have this transaction reference over here. Now, let's say I didn't receive this response, I didn't view it, or I want to query it for some reason. I'm going to use this API and this form to use it. So, back to our solution article over here, you will see that we have an API. You will use the domain along with an endpoint for the payment query that looks like this, and you are going to send it this request payload that we have just seen. It's contained the profile ID and the transaction reference, and in return you are going to receive all the transaction details. This is exactly what we have done here. We have created this profile ID and transaction reference request payload. We have created this endpoint over here. As you can see, it's called query. Where it is, here it comes, the query. Okay, and of course now we're going to test it out. So I'm going to take this transaction, I'm going to go to my query over here, I'm going to reload it, I'm going to pass out the transaction reference, and once I query it, you will see that in response I have received all these transaction details, all its customer detail, shipping details, the payment result, the payment info, all the details. If I'm passing a user defined, I will receive it. All the details that related to this transaction you will receive in this response. Now another way to receive this response is using the cart ID. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually change this just in front of you right now. So right here I'm going to get back to my code, and inside the request payload, and instead of, let's change the request payload over here, and instead of transaction reference I'm going to fill out the cart ID like this. Now I'm going to send the card ID through this form and see the difference. Now the card ID is not a unique value, so this means that a transaction that you have or multiple transactions you have could contain the same card ID. So how would this affect our payment? or our query response. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to take this cart ID over here from the cart details. Cart ID is called cart1, and just pass it into this form over here. Let's see what will happen. I'm going to query it like this, and in return I have received an array of transactions. So these are all the transactions that contain this cart details or this cart ID. Now, this is the difference between using the transaction reference. This will return to you the response of this transaction. Using the cart ID will return you any transaction that you have inside profile with this cart ID. As you can see, I have the same cart ID, the same cart ID, the same cart ID. And for all of them, I have all the transaction details that I want. Now, we can move to the next part that we have learned how to use the query API.